Greetings and good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Bajalan, and I am here with you all tonight on Gaming Materialists, our co-produced show that we do with TIR, and of course, our good friend, the baddest of the left, Mr. C. Vaughn. Hey, Vaughn, how are you doing?
I'm okay. As far as things these days go, we're talking about something that doesn't induce a heart attack. So
Yeah,
that's good.
something that's not super gloomy. Well, it is super gloomy, but it's not really super gloomy.
It's super gloomy, but of no import. So
Of no, yeah, exactly. Of no import. Like most of the things we discuss on this show, they don't really matter. They're just our fantasy hobbies. But everybody needs hobbies.
at
So
least this one's a fantasy hobby that we all admit is a fantasy hobby. But anyway,
that's true. It's not like it's not like organizing as people talk about it today, which seems to be mainly retweeting pro or against Vash tweets. Well, just so the audience is caught up on what we're planning on talking about today, we are very excited to continue on with our discussion of White Wolf Publishing, Vampire the Masquerade, and the broader setting within which Vampire the Masquerade takes place, the so-called World of Darkness. So to recap from what we discussed last time, we talked about the emergence of White Wolf Publishing, the beginnings of Vampire the Masquerade as a role-play game, how Vampire the Masquerade really caught the zeitgeist of the 1990s, how it, to a certain extent, transformed role-playing, bringing in women into the hobby in unprecedented numbers, leading to the formation of a very active LARPing scene where people dressed up and LARPed and did all kinds of things, and how more generally it shifted away, it shifted roleplay games away from the more war games orientated early phase of war games where it was about combat, where it was about statistics and rules, to a kind of role playing that was much more story orientated and story driven. And of course, White Wolf created its own setting, the World of Darkness, Vampire the Masquerade, where everybody plays vampires, was the first game, but it led to a host of different games set in that same universe. Werewolf, the Apocalypse. I don't know. They had all kinds like Changeling, the Dreaming, Wraith, the Oblivion. Uh, what's the other one? Mage, the Ascension. I
Mummy
don't.
the Accursed, I think.
Yeah,
I can't.
actually, there is Mummy the Accursed. I actually have. I discovered going through my boxes at my parents' house that I have a copy of Mummy the Accursed or whatever it's called. Although I
Although
have to,
Chronicles of Darkness even has more. We'll get to that. So
I will say this: like, I do kind of feel like they were running out of supernatural creatures to like make role play games about because, like, Mummy, it's like, come on, man, like. Who wants to play freaking mummies? Like, we're all mummies, and we're all gonna like. What are we gonna do? Like vampires, I get. Werewolves, I get. But once you get started to like Changeling, the Dreaming, it's like, come on. What are you gonna have? Cuck the cucketing. Uh, you know, podcast the failing. I don't know. Like you could have all kinds of things. They had like a very nice formula. So White Wolf goes through the roof in popularity in the 90s. They even have a TV series which you can watch on YouTube. A Vampire the Masquerade TV
and
series.
it's bad.
It's really bad, but it's one of those things where it gets so bad it's good. Excuse me. And but at a certain point, they are publishing so many books, it's difficult to keep up with their meta plot, the storyline. And eventually, in the early 2000s, I think 2003, 2004, they bring the original World of Darkness setting to an end. They publish a book, the Gehenna book. Gehenna is the big end of the world event that has been hinted at for the entire decade and a bit of the game's existence, and they finally end the universe and have a total reboot. And they go into a new world. What it's called? It's not called World of Darkness anymore, is it? Or it is called World of Darkness. Is that right, Vaughn?
It was originally called World of Darkness. It was rebranded in 2000 and believe it was rebranded in 2013 or 2014 as Chronicle. No, 2011 Darkness. Because that's the 20th anniversary of Vampire. I'll get to that later. So there are two major problems with World of Darkness. One affects only the LARPers, and one affected the tabletop. The LARPing became prohibitive to enter because not only did you have to know whatever the local history was for the LARP game that you were playing towards the early middle of the aughts, but also the entire meta plot, particularly if you were in the official Camarilla or One World organization. There was at least 3 major One World organizations, one of which still exists, because all those meta plots were canon to the game. And White Wolf had released a book a month for 10 years, and as we talked about last show, all their stuff was rules and backwards compatible up to this point. So anything published in any other book, even if it contradicted another book, was potentially canon. And the books did contradict each other because they weren't developed with universal oversight. But then in the actual tabletop RPG portion of it, there was another problem. The rules were never compatible between the games, even if the world was. That's kind of a nightmare. Meaning that if you were, even though you're supposed to be playing in the same world, if you were to take a Changeling Lost or a Mage or whatever into your vampire game, or vice versa, you actually had to readjust the stats and rules as an NPC and not follow the rules as published in a book.
And just to clarify on that, is that the basic systems between all these games were the same to a certain degree. So on the surface, it looked like they were compatible, but in terms of the rule sets, they like greatly varied so that they kind of made it impossible to play with. So, for example, werewolves were a lot stronger than vampires, and some of the magic that mages could use basically broke the game if you were playing with other creatures. So
Right,
it wasn't that they were entirely not compatible. It was that they were semi-compatible, but they weren't really very well balanced to play together. They weren't
right.
designed to play. They had the same kind of infrastructure and plumbing, but the facades were quite different, which made it difficult to mesh those games together. And people wanted to play those games together as they were releasing them.
Right. So and furthermore, they were designed not to be played together, but they were antagonists for each other. It made very little sense. And by I mean to get crunchy for a second, the 10-sided dice mechanic was the same for all of them, as was the ability stats, but they weren't balanced at all, and also the powers did not work together. They weren't written to work together. So White Wolf gets all of its designers to do this, and they also start with the idea of, hey, won't it be interesting if you start off as a human, just normal baseline human, and you can even play the entire game now as just a person. All right. What would it do if we redesign this world with that in mind? The first thing they release is Vampire. Now, Vampire the Requiem, which comes out in 2004, and then they release Werewolf the Reckoning.
I think it is Werewolf the Reckoning.
Yeah. And immediately the vampire game has a problem.
Werewolf the Forsaken.
The Forsaken, yes. Excuse me, it's
It's
Hunter the
Hunter
Reckoning, which was an
Hunter
old,
the
yeah. The other thing is their names get really, really redundant, and it gets worse as time goes on. Because
I know if they really are obsessed with this like supernatural creature, the something.
right, so they rebalance everything. They come up with a system where everything has two variables of 5 and 5, and then customizations below that. All the stats start with a baseline human assumption. All disciplines are designed in each game to be interworkable. But in Vampire, they actually keep parts of the old nomenclature and world and not other parts. Now, in the other games, they actually don't do this. Like Mage, all the traditions are erased and they start with new things. And Werewolf, they do the same thing because there's cultural appropriation issues and they're becoming aware of that. White Wolf had always prided itself, as we talked about it being problematic now, but actually for the 90s, it deliberately tried to be inclusive. And
Can
so
you say
early
why?
on, mhm.
Can you say why the original, for example, Werewolf was problematic, was becoming problematic?
Well, I mean, you had stuff like the Fianna, the Geta Finris, and the various Native American tribes turned into werewolves. And they were based on like archetypical views of what it means to be, I don't know, a Viking, what it means to be an Irish person, what it means to be an indigenous person in particular, and an Egyptian in the case of the Anubis, etc. So they had all these ethnic stereotypes that they used. They had originally tried to do this to be less Eurocentric
Right.
in their presentation. Um, that's in Werewolf. Now you had it in Vampire, but not as much. You know, there's only like 3 clans where it was really, really bad in Vampire.
You had the
But
Romany clan, right?
yeah,
The
the
Ravnos,
Ravenos, who
who
were
who
clearly
they
Romany.
who they began to change it because originally they were the Romany clan, and then they were like, oh, actually they're the ruling clan in India, and the only reason it's just that the only ones that come to the West are Romanis. So they
Right.
changed slightly over time. So even
The
within the
Assamites, who are the terrorist Muslim clan.
originally they were the terrorist Muslim clan. Eventually they changed them a bit so that they were also sorcerers and intellectuals. They had like different bloodlines: the assassins, the viziers, and the
Right.
the the
Although
magic
they
guys. And
still
then
had the terrorist.
they still had the terrorists, and also there were the followers of Set who were like Egyptian.
Ancient Egyptians. There's also the followers of Osiris, but they hardly ever came up.
Right.
So, um, so they get rid of all that. They get rid of all that in Vampire 2, actually. They remove all the ethno clans. Like, for example, there is an antagonist clan that is basically the Assamites, 7, but they have no ethnic background in. But they rebalance the game. Um, they redo the world, but they keep enough stuff from the original game in the case of Vampire that it's actually disorienting. Like some of the disciplines are the same, but they don't actually work the same way. A few of the clans are the same, but they're not. Like, so they have the same name, but they have different correlations. So, for example, like the Malkavian, which was another problematic clan, but for different reasons because it was based off of
Mental health.
mental health. They get rid of them and split them between 2 different clans. They give their downside to the Ventru, uh, now the power-based clan. So now the Ventru have a tendency of going insane, which is seen as less problematic because it's specific to power, and so it's
Right.
specific kinds of derangement. And then they give their abilities to the Mikat and take away the whole insanity part of it. So, but there's enough overlapping that people didn't know how different of a game they were getting.
Right.
Because the backlash for people who stayed on with White Wolf for the other games was not there. So, like Changeling, The Lost, which is the Changeling of Dream rewrite, is more popular in some ways and probably a better game, actually, than Changeling of Dreaming. Same was somewhat true even with their Mage game, and Mage was super popular for being super innovative, but they completely changed that world. and they went well. But the only book that was really bought en masse was the vampire book. It was bought. It was one of the best sellers, and then none of the supplements were bought. The other games weren't bought very well, and
People,
they.
because people were invested not simply in the notion of playing a vampire, but they were invested in a meta plot that had been developing and a world that they felt comfortable in for a decade. And even though mechanically this was a very logical rationalization of the rules, the changes in story, and I think you're probably right, the fact that they kept some of the old terminology, some of the old clan names, but put them in a new setting was confusing, and nerds are not known to be big fans of innovation in things that they like, and I think I think I think people unfairly judged that game because they just were like, I want to play my old vampire. I don't want to play a new setting.
I think you're totally right on that. And then you got to add to the additional problem is this game is written to be a tabletop game.
Right.
It is not actually written. They do come up with LARP rules for it, but it's not written to be LARPable in the same way. Also, they at the same time, the Camarilla is disbanded, kind of. It loses its official status because they don't need it anymore. There is a IP conflict because the Camarilla tries to actually claim IP not to fight with White Wolf, but to fight with the other organizations that exist as one World of Darkness playing the old World of Darkness. There's a lawsuit and the Camarilla gets disbanded, but it looks like White Wolf is attacking its fans. So those two things happen at the same time. And in some ways it is unfortunate because I will actually go out on a limb and say that the redesigned game, the Chronicles of Darkness game, is actually a better game in most ways, particularly as a tabletop RPG.
They took a lot of lessons that they'd learned in making games for a decade. But, when you have game systems, especially when you iterate on them, there's a kind of dead weight of old game design that it becomes difficult to get rid of, right?
And I think what we see with them is actually completely parallel to what happened with 3.5 D&D moved into 4th. Now, I don't like 4th D&D, I'll go and admit that. But it was too big of a shift, even though 4th D&D actually, even combat in it's kind of a nightmare, but it was more balanced. And it was, they fixed a lot of problems and created a lot of new ones, but you had the same response. So what did people do in the case of 3.5 to 4th? They went to Pathfinder, which just continued the same thing, but there was no equivalent of that in White Wolf. So White Wolf struggles trying to get people to buy into this for years. They see that some of the downstream games from Vampire actually do okay. Like their Mage game sells okay. I think actually the Changeling game that came out under this Chronicles of Dark, or what will become Chronicles of Darkness, back then was called New World of Darkness, actually did a little better than the original Changeling game. But in general, they didn't have a flagship anymore. The LARPs that survived continued playing the old game. They didn't stop. They kept the same rules. There were a few new Vampire LARPs. But another thing that we have to look at that I don't think gets talked about enough, because we're just talking about this internal to White Wolf. At the same time, what happens in World Playland? Well, during the early aughts, White Wolf is starting to slow down, and White Wolf is continuing to maintain largely off LARP. But tabletop RPGs get revitalized in 2000 by a different company, and that is Wizards launching their version of an open license D&D. And the open license part of it also means that supplementary producers also produce for D&D. So another thing that's been happening in the background that we haven't talked about this because it's periphery. White Wolf kind of predicted this was going to be a problem and started trying to launch non-World of Darkness games. I think the biggest one is Exalted. They also got into developing kind of actually shit stuff, but they ended up developing with themselves and then a couple of people who broke away from Wizards of the Coast. Monty Cook actually worked for White Wolf for a little while, developing kind of cheap D&D products. But these don't do very well either, and they're flooded in the market. So White Wolf's backstop for the World of Darkness, also for this new World of Darkness also doesn't succeed. It is in a glutted market of OGL, of open license D&D stuff, because White Wolf knows that it now has a competitor in Wizards version versus TSSR, which they had crushed.
And I would also add to this, this was also the beginning of the rise of the MMO.
Right.
So a lot of people, now we're seeing a shift away. I don't think MMOs are like in terminal decline or anything like that. But, there was a huge cultural phenomenon of World of Warcraft, people getting into online.
EverQuest, World of Warcraft, etc. Yeah.
The predecessor Star Wars one that they had as well. There was a whole bunch of MMOs that I think attracted people. I think today there is like a little bit of those things come off as a bit faddish in the sense that people are like, yeah, actually I like tabletop roleplay, But I think also White Wolf suffered from the fact that a lot of people were getting into MMOs at that time too.
And the last mistake it did is it didn't just push this new product out, it also pulped its old product. So not only did they not, I mean, and what was maddening about this, they were publishing Dark Ages blanks, for example, new Dark Ages books for the old World of Darkness, up to the moment they launched the new World of Darkness. So they not just had Gehenna in that world, they also had been releasing stuff for their Dark Ages line in the same world, and they kill it after just launching books, including literally a couple of brand new games, Dark Ages Fae and Dark Ages like Mage, so which came out like months before they ended the line. So people also were resentful about that. You released a game that you didn't intend to service like a few months before you ended the entire line. And when they ended the line, they didn't just stop making new versions of that books, they pulled them from the market. All right. So the only way you could get White Wolf books at that point that weren't new World of Darkness books was on the secondhand market, which of course created a price glut, but it also it really drove resentment because I remember being pissed off personally. I quit LARPing by this time, but I was still kind of interested in the books, and I was collecting them, and they literally shifted, and I'm like, shit, I have to buy something completely new, and it wasn't like a fade out; it was just a hard cut.
It was a poorly handled transition.
Right. And so they struggle with this for basically until 2011. But they get the idea. They see the MMOs and like, okay, we can save our business if we get invested into MMOs. So around 2006, I think. Let me actually make sure I'm accurate on that real fast. They get into they basically get into making a massive online role-playing game for the original Vampire the Masquerade because they had a game that had come out right before they ended the line too of Vampire Bloodlines that was incredibly popular as a role-playing game. So they figure they can translate this into an MMO. So they deliberately pair up and get more or less bought out by the owners of EVE Online.
Yeah, so just to give people a bit of context, there was a Troika Games, which is a legendary games company, made this game Bloodlines, uh, and Bloodlines was uh, a flawed masterpiece. People call it. It had good voice acting. It had, it had everything you need to make a good game, but it was very buggy. But people really appreciated that game. And then we see basically the owners of Eve Online come into the scene, and they promise this huge open world RPG, which I think with the popularity of MMOs, I think was very attractive to many Vampire the Masquerade players, especially because it was set in the old setting and not the new setting. And I have a little trailer here for everyone to take a look at. So let's play that trailer, Vaughn. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Turn it up a little bit more.
You won't believe me. In fact, I shouldn't tell you. Some secrets are best taken to the grave. They're all around us. They control everything. They've always been here, waging their secret wars, devouring anything that stands in their way. Cast out of Eden, their souls discarded, their flesh made immortal. Each fond of undying power, tortured by their boundless appetites. We belong to them. Tonight, I was taken. They will come for you. It all begins when you die.
So that trailer, people went nuts for it, right?
Yeah, they did. What's fascinating about that, though, is that now we mentioned a documentary on this. People can go watch it because it covers this probably as much as I'm going to try to go through this real fast. But a couple of things happen at this point. So the new World of Darkness line is doing okay, but it is never gaining anything close to the market share they used to have in the 90s. And they're investing their entire survival strategy off of this game. So CCP Games, who are the people who run EVE Online, like kind of merged with White Wolf
And if
in
you don't know what
2006.
and if you don't know what EVE Online is, it is a huge space economy piracy simulator, which people are super invested in. Like, they sell their spaceships on EVE Online for thousands of dollars. So it's a big game. It's a big, giant.
It's still a big game,
Still a huge game.
but it's not owned by CCP anymore, which is interesting in and of itself. So what happens is they try this. It's not going. This is in development hell until 2015, but it really seems like it's stalling out. White Wolf, in a desperate plea, does two things. It really pushes the game in 2011, and then it releases old World of Darkness back as World of Darkness, rebrands New World of Darkness as Chronicles of Darkness. So now, to correct the mistake they made in the past, they relaunch their old line and maintain the new line. So there's like, so look, if you came in the aughts and you like that product line, we're gonna continue it. If you want to play Vampire the Masquerade, we're gonna release a 20th anniversary edition. We're gonna streamline the rules, but we're gonna keep the world and we're gonna pretend like Gehenna mostly never happened, and we're gonna kind of steady state the meta plot. They do this in 2011, and it actually does sell decently. But two things start to happen. One, most of the world has moved on. All right, people are in the Pathfinder by this point. Tabletop gaming is actually increasing in popularity, but it's not the tabletop gaming which White Wolf came to dominate in the 90s. It is back to something like the War Games tradition, that had come up before too. CCP starts to lose money, not just from all the money it's spending on this White Wolf product line, and not just because it's not really making money in book publishing, because very few people are. All right. Even in like Wizards of the Coast, the actual physical book publishing of it is to get people invested in other things. Let's be honest. What happens is EVE Online kind of reaches peak growth, all right, and starts to fall back. Now it's still to this day actually is pretty well played MMORPG, but MMORPGs in general start to lose steam, and I can tell you why. Cell phone games become popular.
Oh,
I mean, like, seriously. I mean, that's kind of that simple.
excuse me.
MMORPGs are not adaptable to smartphones.
Right.
They are adaptable to consoles, but they're not adaptable to smartphones. And the other thing is, there's all these scandals around this time period about people, even outside of the States, becoming addicted to MMORPGs, like losing their livelihoods to playing them all the time. So this all happens. EVE's not at the top end of that. It's a very beloved game, but it is not World of Warcraft or even something like EverQuest 2, or Elder Scrolls Online or any of that. So it starts to lose money. So CCP, the first thing it does is it spins off White Wolf. It releases the RPG line and says you can have the rights to that. You can form a creative-owned collective called Onyx Path. We'll come back to that. All right. White Wolf will remain devoted to this MMORPG. It will be CCP America. That's what we're going to devote it to. But we're going to have to cut back investment in this game. But they've already been developing it for like 6 years at this point.
Yeah. So there's people are getting fatigued, and it becomes like Star Citizen, the MMO that will never ever see the light of day.
Right. And so this doesn't see the light of day. So Onyx Path gets the rights to both, kind of, this is important, to both the old World of Darkness line and the Chronicles of Darkness, which they rebrand and they continue publishing. But what they not get the rights to? Well, the Vampire the Masquerade 20th edition, which was supposed to relaunch the World of Darkness line, was released by White Wolf, what was owned by CCP. So CCP retains the copyright to just Vampire the Masquerade, part of the World of Darkness. Everything else is spun off. CCP finally sells it after it cans the game in 2015 to Paradox Entertainment. Now, I guess Paradox is also initially planning to release an MMORPG, but that never happens. Okay, so there's this one book and a little bit of a line. The book, the Vampire the Masquerade 20th edition supplement line also goes with Onyx Path. Onyx Path, however, is creator owned and it doesn't have a lot of capital or overhead. So it survives off of two things. Kickstarter, which is coming into being around this time, and Drive-Thru-RPG.
Right.
So it doesn't publish its own books. It just does its own development. And its development is funded by Kickstarter. So they moved from producing, and the other thing you got to know about like White Wolf Books is they produced a nice mid-tier book in the 90s, and the aughts, when they actually used to use terms to compete, they actually produced really, really nice but really expensive books. But they moved these same books over to Drive-Thru-RPG, which, if you've ever bought a Drive-Thru-RPG book, is okay.
But it's not
they're
the
serviceable.
It's not the best. It's a print-on-demand service.
Right, and it's not even like its hardcover editions are not even like they're not stitch bound print on demand or anything like that. It's very standard.
Glue.
They're just glue bound. And actually, I love that now they're ironically more expensive than prestige books. A nice color print from Drive-Thru-RPG can run you for $100.
Right.
And you can buy, from Amazon a mass-produced prestige book for $50 or $60.
Yeah, but I mean, Drive-Thru-RPG really became an important vehicle for a lot of these smaller companies to survive.
Right, and Onyx Path basically moves the White Wolf line from a mass company back to what it began as. Like, it's a small creator-produced company with no corporate backing and very little assets. Doesn't have a lot of overhead. Some people stay on with the line. They stay on with Paradox. So Paradox bought all of its intellectual properties, but the only intellectual property that White Wolf still really had, as White Wolf as a division of CPP, was Vampire the Masquerade. So now you have a problem. You have this revised edition that actually did finally give everybody what they wanted. It cleaned up the rules. It gave people all the old stuff combined in the one book, but it never got serviced correctly. And I never even had this book because I was out of the country at this point. But like, it never got serviced correctly, and it also, after its initial print run is actually super nice editions. But after that, it's only produced through Drive-Thru-RPG. You can still buy it today through Drive-Thru-RPG. That's where you can get it now. White Wolf also makes like TSSR through Wizards makes all of its old stuff available through Drive-Thru-RPG. The real versions sell for a lot now. Onyx Path gets all the other licenses. So now White Wolf is just Vampire the Masquerade. That's it. So Renegade goes to relaunch it. And one, it focuses its distribution actually mostly on Europe. All right. Two, they kind of give up. They create a massive mishap when they release Vampire 5th edition in 2018, because in that book they actually get a lot of the developers and writers from Europe, and some of the writers were actually from Chechnya, and they included some material about the killing of queer Chechens in the meta plot, which was a fundamental mistake. It causes a huge backlash, actually more in Europe than in the United States.
There's also the scandal about, the outright, like there's a description of one of the vampire clans that they might be an outright person. There's a lot of some of the edginess of Vampire the Masquerade gets it into trouble. And I say edginess in inverted commas. Some of the things that may have flown in the 90s are not flying in 2018.
Right, because there's a neo-Nazi aesthetic in a Brewhouse subclan. Like,
yeah.
So that creates a huge backlash. They pull 5th edition immediately. They dissolve the White Wolf independent creative team that had come over from CCP. What little of it was left and hadn't gone on Onyx Path, which wasn't a lot. It's basically Justin Anasili, who's the major vampire director from like 3rd edition, a revised edition forward. And then and so White Wolf. It's one property. It's subsumed into Paradox Entertainment. Paradox Entertainment licenses Renegade Games to come in and run what White Wolf was running, with some of the original team left, and then decides to not even risk distribution rights itself, and runs distribution through the Swedish company. Or I don't know if they're Swedish, but they seem to disproportionately spread Swedish games in English, which is Mordifius. Mordifius becomes their distributor. And this 5th edition Masquerade book has never taken off. It's actually done less well than even the Chronicles of Darkness books. Because the other thing is, its distribution chain actually is not primarily in the United States. It's primarily in Europe. While it has a lot of the same people who were part of the original team, not a lot, a few. Like I said, Justin Asili being the main one. Mark Renhagen occasionally would consult, coming back from obscurity. But in general, there was literally there wasn't a whole lot of push in the United States for it. Period. It was mainly marketed seemingly towards a European audience, and its first out of the gate thing is a scandal. Meanwhile, they also don't have any other parts of the line. All the other parts of the line are still being run by a mixture of the Storytellers Guild and Onyx Press Publishing through Drive to the RPG out of Pennsylvania. All right, so and at one point it's unclear, actually, in 2020 during the Modifius piece, if there was not going to be 2 different Vampire Masquerade editions. If Onyx Path was still going to be publishing 20th 20th anniversary of issuing supplements, and maybe even a 25 year no, I guess we're approaching year 30, actually, a 30-year reboot, or if it was just going to be 5th edition. It looks like the rights have been reverted to just 5th edition. Mordifius is now releasing it to America, but if you look at it's not produced by Modifius or the other major companies it actually releases, like Free Liga and some of the other companies that it releases in America, and it's not really pushed by them very highly either. So it's not even like, it's hard to actually get on Amazon anything more than the base book. You can get the base book, but like the supplements are even hard to get.
Yeah, you have to really look around for them.
Right. Like you can't even order them easily in the United States, and you can't get them through Drive-Thru-RPG because they're not part of Onyx Path Press. So it looks like White Wolf's Vampire Masquerade may finally be coming to an end. I don't know. They're still releasing new supplements for it. But the rights stuff in this has been a nightmare, though, because after the MMORPG, different companies that were not tabletop companies would get it, sublet it, kind of run it as a sub company with a completely different mission, and then let it die. Or sell it off, or subsume it, or this, that, and the other.
Yeah, so it's had a very troubled recent history. I think certainly the 5th edition has given it there's a new interest in it. They moved the meta plot on, so they kind of undid the Gehenna.
Right, Gehenna sort of kind of happened, but didn't.
But didn't.
Yeah.
So we're just going to have to see what direction Vampire the Masquerade is going in. But certainly, I don't see it gaining the cultural relevance it had in the 90s.
No, and LARPing LARPing is pretty much dead. I mean, I think COVID probably finally put the last nail in that coffin, but
The tragedy of the LARPers. Who would think of the LARPers?
yeah, they all went into politics is what happened, and now look what. No, I'm kidding.
They all have podcasts like us now. They all became they all
They all
became
became left celebrities and got to MMORPG their politics instead of their fantasies.
exactly. It's all a big LARP. Vaughn is actually a vampire. He has a character sheet. Maybe we should make a podcasting roleplay game where like everybody plays podcasts, podcasters, and you have different podcaster statistics, anger, parasocial relations,
Anger, parasocial relations,
sexual frustration,
inappropriate Twitter outburst.
inappropriate Twitter outbursts. Yeah, exactly. You have to deal. You have to deal with the aftermath of inappropriate Twitter outbursts.
So I guess the question is, we went through all this history, and this is like the less sexy part in the beginning. But what we can learn, there's a lot of things we can learn from this. One is cultural norms are hard for people to gauge over long periods of time. And one thing I will say about Vampire is, from revised edition in 1998 onward, the lead team is fairly static for 20 years. Like, Justin Asili has been running Vampire and been the head writer in Vampire, and he's good at it. But he's been that person since 1998. He is still that person under the Paradox Entertainment Fifth Ed. He was the major developer for Vampire Requiem too. I mean, it's just been consistent throughout. I think that leads to a certain amount of somewhat what so to say blindness to younger people. But the other thing is, one of the things we haven't talked about this, and Vampire is part of how this happened, is the average age of role players actually went up.
Right.
From the early teens to young adulthood. And in the case of like D&D, it actually D&D age ranges from like 15 to like 55. But if you think about, if you had or people who've been LARPing Vampire since the beginning still in it, those people are now in their mid 50s.
Right.
At youngest. So it's been a long time.
And the break in Vampire the Masquerade has meant that there's a gap in the flow of people coming into the game.
Right.
Like Dungeons and Dragons, for all the troubles it had, there's always been a version of Dungeons and Dragons in print.
Right.
Vampire the Masquerade has not been the case, and people lost interest, and that continuity was broken.
I think there's also a design thing you can learn, is that setting anything contemporaneously to one time, if you even last more than a decade, means you're not going to be contemporaneous even 10 years later. I mean, because one of the things I say about Vampire 20th Anniversary, which is fun, but it's late 90s nostalgia. Like it is a nostalgia game. And it's hard to... I mean, like, how are you going to sell late night? Like, maybe, I will say this. The one thing I will say about 5th edition, I cracked it open yesterday. I've only got a copy of it myself. And to talk about it with you. And it's not. It's the first edition of Vampire that doesn't feel like it's from 1990 or 1999 or whatever. Like,
it's a modern edition of the game, and it's a modern setting and a modern reimagining. For example, and they've done things quite well, I think, to make the game more interesting. So, for example, how do you deal with the rise of communication technology and how that would affect your game? People spying vampires and things like that. Well, they make it that the Vampire Society is like, no mobile phones, guys, because if somebody takes a picture of you doing vampire stuff, we're going to get hunted down by the Inquisition, right? So there's a whole storyline that tackles those things, which late 90s obviously doesn't tackle, right? Because things have moved on. Technology has changed. society has changed, and this is a contemporary game set in the 2020s.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting that it even feels more. It really does feel more European than prior editions too, even though it tries to guest set itself in Chicago, but it doesn't feel that way. I would say that the other thing that's changed is the tendency of the rate of IP to fall. But which is a joke that I find funny. But the fact that this IP has not stayed ever fresh because it was so tied up in one project for so long, that it ate its public visibility.
Right.
And so it's hard to imagine how you'd introduce this game to a new generation of gamers, even though the current edition is actually not bad. I mean, I would say, if I was going to critique the current edition, it's actually mostly in design of the physical book, that it's so pretty, it's
It's too
hard to
glossy.
use.
It's too
Yeah,
glossy. I would have liked a few plainer pages. I'm not into all the color splash in the
yeah.
book.
I would say that it's actually aesthetically over designed.
Yeah,
Um,
totally
to
agree with that.
and it makes it hard to reference actually,
And,
but
and, and annoying to read.
yeah. Um, but it is interesting, but also, like, now the only genre that they have in the World of Darkness is vampire, because everything else is owned by Onyx Path, and Onyx Path is still producing things. It's not. I mean, it drives Mithril sellers on Drive Through RPG. So meaning it's not doing bad in the indie game
No,
market.
and it's surviving. It's surviving. There's a market. They can sell like a good ton of books, right?
Yeah, compared to a lot of things, although I would say that it is now moved from being the default gaming experience, and like it was in the late 90s, to a kind of niche game.
Nostalgia game almost.
Yeah, it's kind of nostalgia. They're still making Chronicles of Darkness stuff. I think the last Vampire the Requiem book was released in 2020.
Yeah, that's still live too. So they are the premium vampire game players. So you can play in multiple and perhaps we'll have to get into a deep dive about the differences in the lore and which one is better at some point.
Yeah, because I'm weirdly a defender of Vampire the Requiem, but I also hated it when it first came out. Like it was.
Discord from the Discord Miniatures channel
Uh,
is happy to come on at some point to talk about the merits of Vampire the Requiem and why she thinks it's better than Old World of Darkness.
I actually do too. I think it is actually I think it's a better world and a better game, but it's never had the popularity. And one thing I will say to it, it's harder to LARP. It's a more complicated social setup, so it's harder to LARP. Uh, but it's easier to play as a tabletop game.
Well,
So,
fair
I would
enough.
love to discuss that with Discourse. That'd be great, because I want to defend the honor. I think maybe I'm not the only one who's come around to this opinion after 20 years,
Well,
but
it's like people get emotional about things. Like when Games Workshop got rid of Warhammer Fantasy, people had a freaking breakdown, but it had become a very cumbersome game, and people like playing Age of Sigmar. Now, I get it that people were upset that they got rid of it, and also they made a stupid business decision because then everybody was playing Warhammer Total War, which is like massive. But I get why they got rid of it because it was a cumbersome rule system and needed to change it.
right. And to be fair, it doesn't affect the Warhammer RPGs, because Warhammer Fantasy has almost nothing to do. The tabletop has almost nothing to do with Warhammer. Uh,
RPG,
our,
it's a quality Well, they've re-released another edition, the fourth edition of it now.
Yeah, I have that over here. It's fourth edition Warhammer Fantasy, which is pretty good. But that same company also makes a Age of Sigmar
Yeah,
Fantasy, which
I do
is
like.
nothing like
No,
Warhammer Fantasy at all.
no, the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay game is very much an iteration on the first and second edition. Third edition is a bit different. Lots of people hate third edition. I actually think it's really good, but it's just a different type of roleplay experience.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I like fourth edition. I've played fourth edition. It's a very enjoyable game. But it's not Age of Sigmar, yeah. So, um, that being said, I do have to apologize to everybody watching or listening tonight about my coughing and sneezing. I have been ill.
You've been ill for like a month.
I recovered, but then I sent my son to nursery. He came back with snot, and then I got sick again. So I'm not super sick now, but I've been coughing. Children are the plague carriers. That's what they are. You put them in a room together, they start producing candlesticks from their noses. So I apologize for my coughing, and I will endeavor not to do that again.
Yeah.
But we do have exciting programming coming up. We're going to be talking to Arbeiter Ian, who's going to talk about his video about, Warhammer having a far-right fascism problem and what we can do about that. And also the responses he got to his video complaining about this far-right problem. Some of which I read, which were quite interesting, things such as everybody's been propagandized to think that Hitler was the bad guy. So, whoa. Okay there, buddy. So we have some interesting programming coming up. So we will bid you all adieu. Thank you for watching. And as we say on This Is Revolution, don't forget to like, subscribe, become a patron if you can afford. Click the like button. Click the other bell button if you really like what we produce. Make sure you look at both This Is Revolution and, of course, Van Vlog, where there's a lot of exciting material coming soon. And, as we say here, we are out.